No aid was expected, until a human warship came thundering from the void. The ceiling of the archive came down in 3 pieces. I remember the sound more than anything else. A deep, grinding crack that started somewhere above the 3rd floor and traveled through the stone, like a slow wave of grief. Dust fell first, then a section of carved beam, then silence. The kind of silence that follows a sound too large for the mind to fully accept. My name is Velsarin. I am or was the senior archivist of the Keth Collective. I say was, not because I am dead, though I came very close, but because the collective as I had known it for 43 years ceased to exist the night the Vreth began their final push on our capital world, Kethavel. What survived would need a new name, I thought. A name built from the rubble of the old one. I was 3 levels below street level when the bombardment reached its peak. Around me, stacked in sealed cases along every wall, were the records of a civilization. Star charts from our first telescopes 400 years ago, medical texts, philosophical arguments that had never been resolved. Poetry written by people whose bones had turned to dust while those words endured. I had spent my entire adult life in service to those records, and now I was listening to the world above them being dismantled piece by piece. The Vreth Dominion did not hate us. That was the part that was hardest to accept. They did not destroy worlds out of anger or revenge. They simply expanded. They had been expanding for 200 years, absorbing smaller civilizations the way a river absorbs rain, without ceremony, without cruelty, and without the slightest hesitation. 17 species had been folded into their structure before us. Some of those species still existed in a technical sense. They had food and shelter and basic medical care. But their governments were gone, their languages were fading, and their histories were being quietly reclassified as Vreth regional folklore. We had watched it happen to others. Everyone in the Galactic Compact had watched it happen. And the terrible truth, the one that I had spent 3 years trying not to say out loud, was that no one had moved to stop it. My colleague Davin pressed his back against the shelving unit across from me. He was younger than me by 15 years. With steady hands and the kind of calm that's not from fearlessness but from having already accepted the worst. He was holding a portable data unit against his chest the way a person holds something precious. Inside it were the last complete language records of the Sirith dialect, spoken by fewer than 2,000 people on our 3rd moon. If that unit was lost, the language was lost with it. I had sent the distress broadcasts myself, all 12 of them, transmitted at intervals over the past 8 months to every major governing body in the Compact. The Talari Conclave acknowledged the first 3 with formal expressions of concern and then went quiet. The Siren Sovereignty sent an envoy who attended 2 meetings, delivered a statement about non-interference principles, and departed. The Delori Unity, who had the largest military fleet in the known Compact, simply never replied at all. Not once. Not a single word. Our ambassador, a patient and brilliant woman named Kaelvis, had cast the net even further. She sent requests to every Compact member, including the fringe species, the newly arrived, the barely mapped, the ones who had only just found their way to the outer diplomatic tables. One of those requests went to a species called humans. I confess I did not know much about them at the time. They had achieved faster-than-light travel roughly a century ago. They had a small delegation at the Compact, 3 representatives who were generally described by the older species as enthusiastic and somewhat difficult to predict. Their home system was far from ours, and their military, by all available assessments, was modest. We sent them the same message we sent everyone else. We did not expect a reply. Kaelvis told me once, during the long months of waiting, that she kept sending the messages not because she believed help would come, but because she believed the record mattered. Someone, somewhere, future or present, would read what had been sent and what had been ignored. That record would be its own kind of testimony. I understood what she meant. I had spent my career in the business of making sure the record survived, even when no one was ready to read it yet. The bombardment paused around the 2nd hour of night. These pauses had a pattern. They lasted between 20 and 40 minutes, long enough for the Vreth targeting systems to recalibrate and for their ground teams to advance their perimeter. Davin and I used those pauses to move. We had memorized the 3 routes from the sub-level vaults to the street, and we rotated between them to avoid predictability. On this particular night, during what I calculated to be the 5th pause of the evening, I made my way up to the ground level of the archive building to assess structural damage. Part of the south wing had collapsed inward. The reading room, where I had spent more mornings than I could count, was open to the sky. Moonlight came through the gap and caught the floating dust, and for just a moment it looked almost beautiful, in the way that ruins sometimes do before you remember what they used to be. I stood at the gap in the wall and looked out over the city. Fires burned in the eastern quarter. The transit hub was dark, which meant it had lost power. The government plaza, visible from the archive roof on a clear day, was not visible at all now, only a glow where it used to be. Our orbital defense platforms had gone silent 2 days ago. The Vreth fleet held the high ground above our world, and there was nothing we could do about it. I found that I was not crying. I had expected to cry at some point during all of this. Instead, I felt a deep, settled stillness that I did not entirely understand. Perhaps it was exhaustion. Perhaps it was the particular peace that comes when a thing you have been dreading for a long time finally arrives and reveals itself to be simply reality rather than catastrophe. It was terrible. It was also just true. The Keth Collective was ending. I was standing in the archive of a civilization that was running out of time. I opened my personal recording device and spoke into it, not because I thought anyone would hear it, but because Kael'vis had been right. The record mattered. I said that we had asked for help. I said that we had asked everyone we could reach, through every channel available to us, over the course of 3 years of declining hope. I said that no answer had come that amounted to action. I said the names of the governing bodies that had been asked and had declined. I said them slowly and clearly so there would be no ambiguity for whoever found the record later. Then I paused and listened to the city. There was no bombardment. There was no ground movement that I could hear. There was wind and fire, and the distant sound of falling masonry settling into new positions. There was the sound of a world being quietly rearranged by people who had decided it belonged to them now. I said one final sentence into the recording. I said no aid was expected. Then I closed the device and started to make my way back down to the vault. I was 2 steps from the stairwell door when the ground moved, not the sharp local percussion of an impact nearby. This was something else, a rolling deep vibration that seemed to come from below the stone, from below everything, as if the planet itself had shifted slightly in response to something arriving above it with tremendous, concentrated force. I stopped. The vibration came again, longer this time, with a harmonic I did not recognize layered underneath it. Davin's voice came up the stairwell before I could turn around. He was shouting, which was unusual enough that it stopped me completely. Davin did not shout. In 11 years of working together through budget crises, political upheaval, 2 prior evacuation drills, and 1 genuine minor earthquake, I had never heard him raise his voice above a measured speaking tone. He was shouting now. He said there was something in the atmosphere. He said the Vreth fleet was repositioning. He said the long-range sensor relay that Kael'vis had left running in the basement was picking up a contact it could not identify, and that the contact was large and fast and descending. I stepped back to the gap in the wall. The sky above our capital had been dark for 2 days, held by the Vreth. Now there was a light in it that had not been there before. Not the steady, cold light of an orbiting vessel. Something moving, something bright, streaking down through the upper atmosphere, with a corona of re-entry heat spreading behind it like the leading edge of a new dawn. It was coming down fast, faster than anything I had ever seen enter atmosphere. Not in a careful, controlled approach, in a dive. Whatever it was not Vreth. The Vreth did not move like that. Nothing I had ever read about in any compact record moved like that. No aid was expected. I stood at the broken wall of my ruined archive and watched fire fall from the sky, and for the first time in 3 years, I did not know what was going to happen next. The ship did not slow down. That was the first thing I could not reconcile with anything in my understanding of how vessels were supposed to behave. Every ship I had ever read about, every entry in every technical manual in the archive's collection, described the same fundamental logic of atmospheric entry. You slowed down, you calculated the angle, you managed the heat, you respected the physics. This ship did not appear to be in conversation with the physics. It came through the upper atmosphere at a speed that should have torn it apart, wrapped in a sheath of plasma so thick and bright that for nearly 40 seconds it was simply a streak of white fire across the night sky. I could hear it from the ground. Not just feel the vibration, hear it. A sound like the sky itself being folded under pressure, a long continuous roar that started low and climbed in pitch as the ship descended, until it was almost too sharp to tolerate, and then dropped suddenly as the vessel leveled out of its dive somewhere in the middle atmosphere. Davin had come up behind me. He stood at my shoulder without speaking. We both watched the plasma corona faded as the ship decelerated, and the shape of it began to resolve out of the light. It was large, very large. Larger than any vessel in the Keth defense fleet, and larger than most of the Vreth cruisers sitting in high orbit. But it was not the size that struck me first. It was the look of it. Telhari's ships were elegant. Every compact member who had seen them remarked on it. long, smooth lines, an almost organic curvature to the hull, surfaces that seemed to catch light and redirect it rather than simply reflect it. Siren vessels were similarly refined in their way, geometric and precise, as if designed by someone who believed that mathematics was its own kind of beauty. This ship looked like it had been designed by someone who was tired of being shot at and had decided to do something about it. The hull was layered, thick, overlapping sections of plating that visibly overlapped at the edges like the scales of some enormous creature. Each plate blackened and scored from re-entry heat. Parts of it were still glowing cherry red. There were no elegant lines. The silhouette was angular, heavy, built around what appeared to be a central core of considerable structural mass, with weapons platforms mounted in positions that suggested they had been added wherever they would be most effective rather than wherever they would look best. It was not beautiful. It was formidable. There is a difference, and in that moment the difference felt extremely important. The Vreth fleet reacted. I could see the repositioning through the atmospheric sensor relay Davin had carried up. 3 Vreth cruisers rotating in high orbit to orient their primary weapons toward the descending contact. The bombardment station, which had been systematically working through the Eastern District, went dark. Everything up there suddenly had a different priority. A voice came through the compact communication array that Kael'vis had left active in the archive basement. Davin had routed it to a portable speaker, and it crackled with interference from the atmospheric disturbance. But the words were clear enough. The voice was a human voice. It was a woman's voice. It was unhurried and direct, and it carried in its tone something that I would later spend considerable time trying to find the right word for. It was not arrogance. It was not bravado. It was a kind of settled certainty. The voice of someone who had made a decision some time ago, and was now simply in the process of carrying it out. She said, "Keth Collective, this is the United Human World ship Unyielding. We received your ambassador's message 11 months ago. We came as fast as we could. Hold on." That was all. Davin and I looked at each other. He said, very quietly, that the humans had come. I had no response to that. I had drafted those distress messages. I had catalogued the non-responses. I had spoken the words "no aid was expected" into a recording device less than 10 minutes ago, with the complete conviction that they were simply true. And now a woman with an unhurried voice was descending out of the sky in a ship that looked like it had been built to absorb punishment, telling us to hold on. 11 months. They had come 11 months after receiving the message. The Unyielding had crossed the distance between human space and Kethavel in 11 months, which I would later learn represented the ship operating at the outer edge of its sustainable drive capacity for the entire journey. The crew had not stopped. They had not waited for political authorization. They had simply come, as fast as the ship would carry them. The Vreth cruisers opened fire. I saw it from the ground. 3 simultaneous energy discharges from high orbit, each one a line of compressed light reaching down through the atmosphere toward the descending human vessel. The targeting was precise. The Vreth were not a careless military. They hit what they aimed at. The Unyielding took all 3. The impacts lit up the dorsal hull like a signal fire. Hull sections flared and portions of the outer plating vaporized in clouds of superheated metal. The ship lurched visibly, even from my distance on the ground, rolling under the impact before stabilizing, and kept descending. It did not return fire from a distance. It did not climb back to a defensible altitude. It did not attempt to exit atmosphere and reassess. It accelerated downward, toward the Vreth ground perimeter that had been advancing on our city, and as it fell it began to return fire, not at the cruisers above it, not yet, but at the Vreth ground equipment positioned in the northern outskirts of the city. I later learned that this was called a strafing approach. I had never encountered the term before. The concept, as I understood it, was to use the speed and mass of the vessel itself as a tactical advantage during descent, converting the vulnerability of atmospheric entry into an offensive action. The Vreth had never encountered anything doing it in precisely this way. Their ground perimeter began to pull back. The Unyielding leveled out at low altitude, barely 500 meters above the city surface. At that range I could see the full length of it passing overhead, and I experienced something I had not expected. Awe, not at the power of it, not at the damage it was causing to the Vreth perimeter, but simply at the fact of it. A ship that had traveled months through empty space had arrived at the exact moment when arrival meant something, and was now doing the one thing that no one else in the galaxy had been willing to do. It was fighting for us. The Vreth bombardment station reactivated and attempted to reacquire the Unyielding as a target. It managed one shot. The beam struck the ship's port side, and a secondary explosion walked across that section of hull. blowing out what appeared to be an engine nacelle. The ship listed briefly and then corrected. The weapons platforms on the starboard side rotated, and the unyielding returned fire at the bombardment station with everything they had. The bombardment station went silent, not gradually, not in stages, entirely and immediately. One moment it was there, a dark shape in the upper atmosphere, and the next moment it was 3 expanding clouds of debris catching the first light of dawn. Davin made a sound I had never heard from him. Not a word, just a sound. I understood it. The remaining 2 Vreth cruisers descended from their orbital positions, angling into the upper atmosphere to engage. This was unusual Vreth behavior. They typically preferred to fight from orbit, where their tactical systems functioned optimally. That they were choosing to descend told me something about how they were assessing the situation. They were not treating this as a minor contact. They were committing. The unyielding turned to face them. This was the moment I want to be clear about, because I have told this story many times and I know which part people find hardest to believe. The human ship, which had already absorbed 4 significant weapon strikes, which had a visibly damaged port section, and was trailing debris from 2 separate hull breaches, which was operating alone in the atmosphere of a foreign world against a fleet that held orbital superiority. That ship turned toward the Vreth cruisers rather than away from them. It closed the distance at full thrust. The combat that followed lasted 47 minutes by the archive clock. I did not watch all of it from the gap in the wall. At some point, the structural integrity of the building made the ground floor too dangerous, and Davin pulled me back to the sublevel, where we sat in the vault with the sealed cases of records around us, and listened to the fighting above. The sounds were extraordinary. Not just weapons fire, but the secondary sounds of a ship operating at its absolute limits, the deep groaning of stressed hull material, the crack of something failing and being immediately compensated for, the rhythmic percussion of weapons cycling faster than their rated capacity. The Vreth cruisers were good. They were experienced ships with experienced crews who had won many engagements. But they had been designed to fight in space, at range, against opponents who followed predictable tactical models. The unyielding did not follow predictable tactical models. It pressed into close range where the Vreth targeting systems were less effective. It used the city terrain as cover in ways that the Vreth commanders clearly had not anticipated. It took damage and kept functioning in ways that a Vreth commander, by their own doctrine, would have classified as impossible. Sometime around the 4th hour of morning, the second Vreth cruiser went dark. I knew because the weapons sound stopped and the only thing left was the low, strained hum of the unyielding's drives. Then a different sound, the compact communication array activating. Commander Okonkwo's voice again, still unhurried. She said that the immediate Vreth surface threat had been neutralized. She said that the remaining Vreth cruiser had withdrawn to a higher orbit. She said that she was dispatching a shuttle to our location, and she asked if any Keth leadership personnel were present who could speak to her crew. I sat in the vault surrounded by the records of my civilization, with dust in my hair, and a crack running through the wall beside me that had not been there yesterday, and ISIS. The shuttle came down in the plaza outside the archive, in the space that had once been a garden with a water feature that the city planners had been very proud of. The garden was gone now, but the plaza was large enough, and the shuttle was smaller than I expected, a compact, angular craft that landed with the same directness that seemed to characterize everything this crew did. 3 humans came down the ramp. I had seen images of humans before in the compact records, but images are incomplete in the way that all representations are incomplete. They were shorter than I had expected, averaging perhaps a head's height below my own, with the kind of bilateral symmetry that several compact species shared. 2 women and 1 man, all 3 in uniform, and all 3 moving with the crisp purposefulness of people who had not slept in some time, but were not going to let that be relevant. The one in front introduced herself as Lieutenant Commander Adele Porter, first officer of the Unyielding. She had close-cut hair, gray at the temples, and a focused expression that made me feel she was already 3 steps ahead of whatever conversation we were about to have. Behind her was a crew member named Owen Hartley, who carried a medical kit, and immediately began looking at the injuries among the Keth staff who had emerged from the sublevel. The third was a young woman named Nadia Birch, communications specialist, who was already interfacing with our compact array before she had finished descending the ramp. Porter shook my hand. I had read about human handshakes. In practice, it was firmer than I expected. She said the commander wanted to speak with me personally when the immediate situation permitted. She said they needed to understand the status of the surviving Keth population across all 4 worlds. She said they were working on establishing a communication link to the Unyielding's tactical center so I could speak to Commander Okonkwo directly. I asked how the ship was. Porter gave a small smile that contained several things at once. She said the ship was functional. I looked at the shuttle behind her, and through its open ramp at the gray interior, at the equipment secured to the walls in ways designed for a crew who expected turbulence to be a standard working condition. There were scorch marks on the outer hull of the shuttle that had not come from today. They had come from other days, other places, other decisions to fly toward something rather than away from it. I thought about the 11 months. I thought about a ship that had driven itself across the dark at maximum capacity, without authorization that I would later learn had not yet been formally granted, because a message had been received, and the people who received it had decided that receiving a message like that created a responsibility. No aid was expected. I was going to need to correct the record. Adele Porter took me up in the second shuttle run, along with 3 surviving members of the Keth Council. The ascent was different from anything I had experienced in our own government transport vessels. There was no gradual managed climb. The shuttle went up the way the ship had come down, directly with an urgency that felt personal. The Unyielding was larger from close range than it had appeared in the atmosphere. Passing alongside its hull on approach to the docking bay, I could see the full extent of the damage from the night's fighting. 3 sections of outer plating had been burned away entirely, exposing the structural framework beneath. The port nacelle that had taken the direct hit from the bombardment station was gone. Not damaged, gone, the attachment point still glowing faintly at the edges. Hull scoring ran in long parallel lines across the dorsal surface where Vreth weapons had connected. And yet the ship's systems were running. The lights in the docking bay were steady. The air recyclers were functioning. The crew moved through the corridors with the practiced efficiency of people who were fully in control of their environment. I had expected something like the Talhari vessels I had visited once, years ago. Clean corridors, soft ambient lighting, the quiet hum of systems engineered to minimize their own presence. Those ships had felt like buildings, controlled, deliberate spaces in which the crew existed. The Unyielding felt lived in. The corridors were narrower, the ceiling lower. There were notes attached to equipment panels in a handwritten script I could not read. The lighting was functional rather than comfortable. In 3 places I passed damage control teams working on wall panels, talking to each other in low, rapid exchanges while their hands moved continuously. One of them was eating something from a container while she worked. She did not look up. The smell was different from anything I had encountered on any other vessel. Metal, yes, and the specific quality of recycled ship air, but also something organic underneath it that I later identified as the collective physical presence of 280 people who had been living and working in close quarters at high operational intensity for 11 months. It was not unpleasant. It was the smell of habitation, of a community that had been somewhere together for a long time and had left traces of itself in the air. Porter brought me to the command deck, which was the name the humans used for what we would call the operations center. It was not what I expected. There were no ceremonial elements, no formal distinction between the space of command and the space of function. It was simply a room full of active stations, every position occupied, every screen showing data that someone was actively working with. Commander Yale Okonkwo was standing at the central display with her back to the entrance when I arrived. She was reviewing a tactical overlay of the orbital positions with her chief navigator, a lean, quiet man named Fletcher Kane, pointing at 3 points on the display and asking questions in a tone that was neither urgent nor relaxed, but something in between, the tone of someone who was continuously processing. She turned when Porter announced me. She was shorter than I had imagined. Based on nothing rational, I had constructed a mental image of someone physically imposing. Instead, she was a compact woman of perhaps 50 years in human terms, with close-cropped dark hair going silver, skin the warm brown that I would come to associate with a significant portion of the Unyielding's crew, and eyes that took in my presence with an immediate, focused attention that was slightly unnerving. Her left forearm, I noticed, was wrapped in a temporary burn dressing. The dressing was applied well but quickly. She had not yet found time to have it properly treated. She said my name correctly. She extended her hand, firm, like Porter's. She said she was glad I was on my feet. I said I was glad to be on them. She gestured to a chair beside the central display and sat in the adjacent one. And without preamble, she asked me to tell her the status of the Keth population across all 4 worlds. Not as a briefing, as a direct question, the first of what I quickly understood would be many. For the next 40 minutes I told her everything. the population counts, the location of surviving government infrastructure, the status of the other three worlds, which had not yet been subjected to direct bombardment, but which the Vreth had been systematically isolating from outside contact, the extent of our remaining defense capacity, which was minimal. She listened without interrupting, and the few questions she asked were precise and practical. Not how are your people coping, but how many of your militia units still have functional communications. Not sympathy but utility. She was building a picture. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me the question I had not asked myself yet, which was what the Keth wanted. Not what we needed, what we wanted, what kind of outcome we were working toward. I told her we wanted to survive. I told her we wanted our worlds and our records and our languages and our right to continue making our own decisions. I told her we were not asking for conquest on our behalf or for the Vreth to be eliminated. We were asking to exist. She nodded. Not as if this was a remarkable thing to ask, as if it were the plainest possible position. Then she sat forward and told me something that changed the shape of what I had been assuming about this situation. She said, the Human Worlds Council had authorized a single ship. She said that authorization had, technically, not come through before the Unyielding departed. She said she had filed her flight plan based on an earlier preliminary resolution that had not yet been voted on. She said that legally, this placed her in a complicated position that she was going to have to answer for when she returned home. I asked her why she had left before the authorization was confirmed. She looked at the tactical display for a moment. Then she looked back at me. She said, because the vote was going to take another 3 weeks, and the message from your ambassador was 11 months old already, and she had done the mathematics of what 3 more weeks meant for a population under active bombardment. She said it simply, not as a declaration of heroism, not as an explanation requiring validation, as a statement of fact about how she had understood the situation and what she had concluded from it. I asked her the question that had been pressing at me since I heard her voice come through the compact array in the early hours of morning. I asked her why, not why she had left before authorization, why any of this, why a human ship, a single ship from a species that barely knew us, had crossed the dark to answer a message that every major compact power had decided was someone else's problem. She was quiet for a moment that I did not try to fill. Then she said, because you asked. And because nobody else was going to, I waited, she said. Humans have a word for watching something terrible happen and doing nothing because it isn't your business. It is not a good word. It describes a failure of something that people feel they are supposed to be. She said most humans, most of the time, found that they could not comfortably be that word, especially when someone had specifically asked for help. She said it the way she said everything, plainly, without decoration, as if it were just information. The most obvious thing in the world. I have thought about those words many times since that morning. I have thought about the fact that she was describing something cultural, something her species carried in itself that had survived the process of becoming a spacefaring civilization. This discomfort with the act of non-intervention. The older compact species had lost that somewhere, or perhaps pushed it into a smaller and smaller corner of their collective priorities as they grew larger and more settled and more concerned with their own stability. The Talhari had been a spacefaring civilization for 800 years. At what point in those 800 years had they learned to be comfortable with the word she was describing? The Unyielding had been in battle for 8 hours. The crew was running on stimulants and the particular energy that comes from having completed something extremely difficult and not yet having permission to stop. Around us on the command deck, people were doing their jobs, quietly, efficiently, without performance. 2 stations over, a young man named Callum Ross was updating orbital tracking while eating a meal from a container, the same behavior I had observed in the corridor below. I would come to understand that eating at your station during operations was entirely normal, on a human vessel, and that it was a practical adaptation rather than a lack of decorum. Humans became physically ineffective when they did not eat at regular intervals. The Unyielding's culture had been built around that reality, rather than pretending it was inconvenient. Fletcher Kane, the navigator, interrupted us to report that the remaining Vreth cruiser had moved to a higher orbital position and appeared to be holding rather than departing. This was, according to Kane, consistent with waiting for reinforcement. He said it with the same even tone that everyone on this ship seemed to use, for all information regardless of its severity. Okonkwo looked at the display. Then she said, how many of your people can fight? Not how many people do you have, how many can fight? I told her the number. It was not large. She said, it would have to be enough. She stood up and moved to the communications station. and I watched her begin the process of contacting the surviving Keth councils on the other. 3 worlds. She introduced herself by name and rank. She explained the situation without minimizing it. She asked specific questions about local defense capacity and communication infrastructure. She spoke to 4 different governing bodies over the next 90 minutes, each time in the same even, direct register, not reassuring them with empty words, but engaging with them as partners in a shared problem. At one point, while she was waiting for the 3rd Council's communications officer to establish a clear channel, she turned to me and said quietly, "Your ambassador's message was well written." I said that the Calvis was a careful communicator. Okonkwo said, "She put the right things in it. She made it real. Documents like that are easy to write badly. All numbers and facts, no people." She wrote about the people. I did not know what to say to that. I stored it for later, along with everything else. The work continued. The Unyielding's chief engineer, a serious, methodical man named Barry Holden, came to the command deck to report on hull repair status. The port nacelle was a total loss, which reduced their drive capacity to 73% and limited both their speed and their options for emergency maneuver. The 3 sections of burned-away outer plating could be partially addressed with materials on hand, but not fully restored without a dry dock. The ship was functional but diminished. Holden presented these facts with the tone of someone describing a repair list rather than a crisis. Okonkwo received them with the same tone. They discussed options. The conversation was not heated and not resigned. It was 2 people doing arithmetic about a complicated situation. I noticed something during that conversation. Neither of them talked about retreating. The option was not raised. It was not declined. It was simply absent from the discussion, the way you might not mention walking when you are planning a journey of several thousand kilometers. Not rejected. Simply not relevant. The Unyielding was here. It was going to remain here. That had been decided before they crossed the dark, and no accumulation of damage had so far caused anyone on board to revisit the decision. I sat in a chair on the command deck of a ship that had no business being in my solar system, surrounded by people who had chosen to come here for reasons that were, fundamentally, entirely human in the most specific sense, and I began, slowly, to understand that something had changed. Not the tactical situation, not yet. The Vreth were still up there, and the reinforcements were still coming, and the odds were still not favorable by any measure I knew how to apply. What had changed was the silence. For 3 years, the silence had been total. We had sent our messages into the dark, and the dark had returned nothing. And then one ship had come through it, trailing fire. And that single arrival had broken something structural in the silence, had proven that it was not a law but a choice, and that choices could be made differently. I asked Okonkwo at one point, while she reviewed the Keth militia communication logs, how many crew members the Unyielding was carrying. She said 283. I thought about that number. 283 people who had left their homes and crossed the dark for 11 months to come to a world they had never seen to help a people they barely knew anything about. 283 individual decisions made every morning during those 11 months to keep doing what they had started. To stay at their stations, to eat their meals at their posts, to sing their work chants when the hull groaned, to make the choice again and again and again. 283 was a very small number. It was the largest number in the known compact. The long-range sensors aboard the Unyielding were better than anything in the Keth fleet's existing inventory, and Fletcher Kane was very good at reading them. He was the one who identified the Vreth reinforcement signal first, 3 days after the initial engagement. He brought the data to Okonkwo without drama and laid it out in numbers. 7 ships, a heavy cruiser designated as Fleet Command, 4 standard cruisers of the type we had already encountered, and 2 vessels that Kane's pattern recognition software classified as support carriers. Slower, less armored, but capable of deploying a significant number of smaller combat craft. The fleet was 5 days out at standard Vreth transit speeds. The command deck was quiet for the moment after Kane presented the numbers. Not a frightened quiet, a thinking quiet. I was present because Okonkwo had made a habit of including me in the operational discussions, not out of courtesy, but because I knew things about Keth planetary infrastructure and militia capability that her crew needed. I had stopped feeling like a guest on the command deck and started feeling like a member of a working group, which I suspected was entirely intentional. The Unyielding was in no condition to take on 7 ships in an open engagement. The port nacelle was gone, 3 hull sections were operating on improvised patches, and the weapons cycling had been reduced to 68% capacity, while Holden's teams worked on the damaged systems. Okonkwo had been clear-eyed about this from the day Kane first raised the reinforcement probability. She had not waited for the confirmation to start planning. She had spent the 3 days since the initial battle doing 3 things simultaneously. The first was coordinating with the surviving Keth councils on all 4 worlds to consolidate communication infrastructure and establish a unified command channel for the militia units. The second was using the Unyielding's long-range communications array, which was far more powerful than anything the Keth had on the surface, to broadcast the complete record of the Vreth engagement, including sensor logs, weapons data, and every frame of the visual record from the ship's exterior cameras to every compact receiver within range. The third was sending a message home. She told me about the third one on the evening of the second day, while we were both in the ship's small common area, a narrow room with a table and what the humans called a coffee dispenser, which I had been experimenting with and found both terrible and compelling. She said she had transmitted a full situation report to the Human Worlds Council. She said she had told them the exact state of affairs and what she assessed was coming. She said she did not know what the council would decide, but she had given them everything they needed to decide clearly. She said, "I did what I thought was right getting here. Now they get to decide what to do about the bigger picture." "That's how it's supposed to work," I said. "You might be disciplined for coming before the authorization was confirmed." She looked at her cup. She said, "Probably." I said, "Does that concern you?" She thought about it for a moment. She said, "It concerns me that the process was slow. But the process is there for good reasons. You don't want military commanders just doing whatever they personally decide is right, with no accountability. That gets complicated very fast. So yes, I'll answer for it when I get home, and I'll answer honestly. I thought about that. The older compact species had militaries that operated within vast, ancient bureaucratic structures designed to prevent exactly the kind of unilateral action that had brought the Unyielding to Keth Avil. Those structures had worked, in the sense that no Talhari warship had ever done anything without 17 layers of authorization. They had also meant that we received 12 formal expressions of concern and 0 ships. On the 4th day, Okonkwo called a full command meeting. The meeting was not held in the command deck but in a larger space that the crew called the Situation Room, and every senior officer was present. I sat in the back, next to Nadia Birch, who had spent the past 3 days doing things with a compact communications array that I was still not fully understanding but which I knew were important because Okonkwo kept asking her for updates. Okonkwo laid out the tactical picture plainly. 7 ships incoming, the Unyielding at reduced capacity. The Keth militia organized now, with communication protocols that Holden's engineering team had helped calibrate, but still lightly armed and without significant combat experience. The planetary surface was defendable in certain areas but not across all 4 worlds simultaneously. Then she said something that I want to record exactly. She said, "We are not going to meet them in open space. We don't have the capacity for that right now, and it wouldn't serve the Keth even if we did. We'd be fighting for position while they're ground. Forces moved. What we are going to do is fight smart. We are going to use what we have, which includes the Keth people, this ship, this crew, and everything I've been building toward for the past 4 days." She looked around the room. She said, "The broadcast has been received. I've had confirmation from 6 compact stations that the feed is active. Whatever happens in the next 48 hours is going to be watched and recorded by more eyes than the Vreth are comfortable with. That changes the calculation for them even if they don't know it yet," she said. "Fletcher, show them the defensive grid." Kane pulled up the orbital overlay. The grid he had designed was built around the Unyielding as a fixed point, positioned above the capital world at an altitude that kept it within supporting range of the militia units on the surface, while placing it at the intersection of the most likely Vreth approach vectors. The Keth militia ships, 14 small vessels with limited but functional weapons, were positioned in a layered pattern that used Kethavel's 2 moons as anchor points. The geometry had been worked out over 3 days in consultation with the militia commanders. Porter explained the tactical logic to the room. The Vreth fleet's strength was its number and its orbital supremacy. The grid was designed to deny them clean orbital supremacy by forcing engagement at a height where the Unyielding's close-range advantage was relevant. The militia ships were not expected to defeat Vreth cruisers in direct combat. They were positioned to channel, to redirect, to create moments where the Vreth fleet had to choose between targets, and where each choice opened a vulnerability that the Unyielding could exploit. It was not a plan designed to win a conventional battle. It was a plan designed to make a conventional Vreth victory expensive enough to be strategically useless. Holden said, The ship will take hits. Okonkwo said yes. He said significant ones. She said probably. He looked at the overlay for a moment, then he said, I'll have the repair teams positioned for immediate response. We'll patch as we go. That was all. No further discussion of the cost. The cost had been accepted at the beginning of the 11-month journey. Everything since had been a continuation of the same decision. The Vreth fleet arrived early, at 37 hours rather than the projected 48. Kane identified them on long-range sensors and calmly informed the command deck. The acceleration to battle stations on the Unyielding was fast enough that I barely had time to register it. One moment normal operational tempo, the next every system fully active and every crew member at their post. I was on the command deck. Okonkwo had not asked me to leave, and I had not offered to. There was nothing I could do operationally, but there was a record to be made, and I was the archivist. The Vreth fleet's approach was confident. That was readable even from sensor data. The formation was designed for overwhelming force delivery, not for an engagement where they expected serious resistance. The heavy cruiser held back, in the position a fleet commander would take, when they expected the action to be finished quickly by the forward elements. They had not updated their assessment of the Unyielding since the first engagement. That was, as Porter noted quietly to me, a significant error. The first exchange came at extreme range, Vreth cruisers testing the defensive grid with probing fire. The militia ships held their positions. The Unyielding did not move. Okonkwo watched the display and waited. The Vreth advanced to medium range. The formation began to spread, attempting to envelope the grid from multiple angles simultaneously. This was the tactical pattern that the Vreth had used against every compact species they had ever engaged. It was very effective against opponents who responded by trying to meet every threat at once. Okonkwo said, now, and the grid moved, not the Unyielding, the militia ships. 14 small vessels acting in coordination for the first time in their history, following the communication protocols that had been calibrated over 3 days, executed a coordinated repositioning that collapsed the left flank of the Vreth envelope attempt and pushed 2 cruisers into a narrow channel between the moons where their maneuver space was sharply reduced. The Unyielding moved into that channel. What followed was the kind of fighting that I do not have clean language for. It was fast, close, loud in the system data even if space itself makes no sound, and it demanded from the Unyielding's crew a quality of continuous rapid response that I would not have believed possible if I had not been watching it. Every hit the ship took was immediately assessed, compensated for, worked around. Holston's teams moved through the corridors, with the urgency of people running toward, rather than away from the problem. Systems that went offline were rerouted in seconds. Damage that would have ended a smaller crew's ability to function was absorbed and integrated. Callum Ross at the tracking station called out Vreth positions in a continuous, steady flow. He did not raise his voice once. His hands moved on the interface, with the ease of someone who had been doing this for so long that his body had learned to think faster than his mind needed to. At some point during the 3rd hour of the battle, the Unyielding's main drive failed. This was the moment I had been afraid of, the moment when the arithmetic became too unfavorable. Without the main drive, the ship could not maneuver. We were a fixed weapons platform in a battle that required movement. Okonkwo did not pause. She said to Kane, give me our current firing vectors. Then she said to the weapons officer, a young woman named Sophie Crane, optimize every platform for our fixed position. We are the anchor now. Let them come to us. She used the ship as a wall. The militia ships pulled back behind the Unyielding's bulk, using it as cover to regroup and reposition, protected by the fire coming from its weapons platforms. The Vreth had to come through the Unyielding to get to them. To come through the Unyielding, they had to accept the fire. They accepted it, but it was not the clean, rapid engagement they had planned. Every advance cost them. Every attempt to go around the stationary dreadnought exposed them to fire from 2 directions. The heavy cruiser, which had hung back expecting a short engagement, began to maneuver, too late, into a position that Kane had noted 3 hours ago and Porter had quietly prepared for. Sophie Crane said, without particular drama, I have the heavy cruiser. Okonkwo said, take it. The heavy cruiser's drive systems failed under the concentrated fire. It did not break apart. It drifted. A drifting ship cannot command a fleet. A fleet without command, facing unexpectedly sustained resistance, without the quick victory that justified the fuel and the commitment, facing a record being broadcast to the entire compact. That fleet did something that Vreth fleets had never previously done in 2 centuries of expansion. It withdrew, not all at once, not cleanly, but the forward cruisers broke off first, then the remaining vessels, one after another, pulling back toward the outer system. The heavy cruiser was recovered by a support carrier. And then they were gone, climbing toward the transit distance, and Keth Avel's sky was quiet. I had been holding the archive recorder the entire time. I had recorded every exchange on the command deck, every course correction, every calm voice reading damage assessments and tactical data. I had recorded Sophie Crane's voice saying, "I have the heavy cruiser." I had recorded Okonkwo's voice saying, "Take it." I had recorded Fletcher Kane running tracking data without raising his voice once through 4 hours of sustained combat. I had recorded Barry Holden's damage reports, each one delivered as a status update rather than a crisis. Okonkwo stood at the central display and looked at the cleared space where the Vreth fleet had been. Around her, the crew remained at their stations. No one cheered. A few people exchanged quiet words. Someone at a back station put their head down on their folded arms for 30 seconds and then lifted it and went back to work. She turned and looked at me. I said, "I have it all." She said, "Good." She said it the same way she said everything, plainly, as if the most important thing now was what came next. I am recording this in the rebuilt archive, in a room that smells of fresh-cut stone and the cedar oil they use on new shelving here. The crack in the wall beside the stairwell has been filled. The south wing's open sky is covered again. The reading room where I spent so many mornings has its roof back and its windows, and on certain mornings the light comes through at the same angle it always did and lands on the same section of the eastern shelving, and I stand in it for a moment before I start work. It has been 7 years since the Unyielding came down through the atmosphere of Kethavel. I am going to try to tell the last part of the story in the order in which things happened, because the order matters. In the days immediately following the Vreth fleet's withdrawal, the compact communication channels were different. Not silent, not the careful diplomatic silence that had answered our distress messages for 3 years. Loud, the broadcast that Nadia Birch had been building and transmitting through the Unyielding's array. Every sensor record, every weapons log, every visual frame from the engagement, and the complete archive of Vreth actions against the Keth going back to the first orbital survey, had reached every major compact station within transmission range, which was most of them. The array on the Unyielding was very powerful. The Talhari Conclave issued a formal statement within 48 hours of the Vreth fleet's withdrawal. The statement condemned the Vreth Dominion's actions and called for an emergency compact session to discuss collective response. I read Izay several times looking for the phrase, "We should have acted sooner," and did not find it, but I understood that the statement being issued at all was its own form of acknowledgement. The Siren Sovereignty sent a naval detachment to the Keth system within 3 weeks. 2 ships, then 4, then a full squadron. They established an exclusion zone around Kethavel that the Vreth did not test. The Delori Unity, who had never replied to our original distress messages, sent a delegation to the emergency compact session and voted in favor of every resolution on the agenda. They were, Calvis told me afterward, very emphatic in their support. She said it with a dryness in her voice that I appreciated. The compact coalition that assembled over the following 6 months was not built on altruism alone. The Vreth had grown large enough that several compact members had begun privately assessing them as a long-term threat to everyone, not just to smaller species. The Keth situation provided the specific incident that converted a general unease into a political commitment. I am honest enough to record that. The motives were mixed, as most large political actions have mixed motives, but the outcome was real. The Vreth Dominion, faced with a coordinated compact coalition rather than individual isolated species, entered a period of political instability that their expansion doctrine had never required them to plan for. Their military, optimized for rapid conquest of smaller powers, was not structured for a prolonged defensive posture. Over the following 4 years, under sustained diplomatic and military pressure, the Dominion's outer acquisitions were negotiated back to independence, one by one, with compact guarantees. The 17 species that had been absorbed before us were given sovereignty agreements. Some of them had been inside the Dominion structure for so long that the transition was complicated. Some languages had been lost. Some governments had to be rebuilt from the memory of what they had been, rather than from living institutions. It was not a clean restoration. It was a real one. Commander Yael Okonkwo returned to human space after the Vreth fleet withdrew. She took the Unyielding home under reduced drive capacity on a journey that took considerably longer than the outward trip. She faced her court-martial. I followed the proceedings through the compact communications network, reading the transcripts that Nadia Birch forwarded to me. The case against her was that she had departed before the Human Worlds Council's authorization vote was complete, technically placing the mission outside formal sanction. The case in her defense was that the preliminary resolution existed, that the full vote concluded in her favor 9 days after she departed, and that the mission had in fact succeeded. The proceedings lasted 6 days. She was acquitted. I am told that her testimony was delivered in the same even, direct tone she used for everything. I believe this without needing to be told. The Human Worlds Council subsequently codified what they called the Keth Doctrine. I have a copy of the original document in the archive. It states, in the careful language of formal policy, that a documented request for aid from a population under threat of destruction, once received by any Human Worlds government body or military command, cannot be indefinitely delayed on procedural grounds when the delay itself causes harm. The doctrine does not eliminate process. It places process in service of the outcome rather than above it. It became, over the following years, one of the most discussed policy documents in compact diplomatic circles. Several other species adopted versions of it, not all of them, but some. The Unyielding was repaired in a human dry dock over the course of 4 months. I saw images of it afterward. The hull had been replated. The port nacelle was, new it looked from the outside, nearly identical to the ship I had first seen descending over Kethavel trailing fire. The crew would tell you it was the same ship. The record would agree with them. At the ceremony where the Keth Restoration Council formally issued its acknowledgement of the engagement, not a treaty, not an alliance, but a recognition, a naming of what had happened, the council chose to honor the Unyielding with a hull sigil. This is the oldest form of Keth recognition, older than our written records. It is a mark placed on something to indicate that it is part of the story of our people. It had not been awarded to any non-Keth vessel in 300 years. The last previous recipient had been a Keth explorer ship that had saved a colony settlement from a stellar event, long before we had FTL travel. The sigil was placed on the Unyielding's hull at the port nacelle mount, the location of the most visible damage. I was told that Okonkwo stood in the shipyard and watched the ceremony feed on a screen, and that when it was finished she was quiet for a moment, and then returned to reviewing her crew rotation schedule, because the Unyielding was being cleared for active service, and there were things to be done. I have been asked many times, in the years since, to characterize what the humans did, to explain it, to put it in a framework that makes sense within the context of compact politics and interstellar relations. I am an archivist. Making sense of things is what I do. The older compact species had arrived at a kind of stable equilibrium in which self-interest was the governing principle and intervention was the exception that required extraordinary justification. This was not cruelty. It was the accumulated pragmatism of centuries of political experience. You learned to protect your own. You learned to keep your commitments manageable. You learned that the universe was very large, and that you could not answer every call. The humans had not yet learned that. Whether they had not learned it because they were young, or whether it was something more fundamental to what they were. Something that ran deeper than political experience and would not be smoothed away by centuries of exposure to the large, complicated galaxy. I cannot say with certainty. I have my theory. I have watched them for 7 years now, through the events I have described, and through the smaller events that followed, and my theory is that it is the second thing. I think there is something in them that genuinely cannot fully accept the comfortable distance between their own well-being and the suffering of others. Not that they are immune to self-interest, they are not. Not that they are incapable of inaction, they certainly are. But there is a resistance in them, a friction. When they look away from someone who has asked for help, something in them registers the act of looking away as a cost, and that cost is not comfortable for them. Whether that is wisdom or simply a particular kind of stubbornness, the results are the same. Adele Porter was promoted to commander and given her own ship, a newer vessel in the human fleet that she named after a word in one of the old human languages meaning perseverance. Fletcher Kane became a senior navigation instructor at the Human Space Academy, where I am told he teaches his students the same way he worked, quietly, steadily, without raising his voice. Barry Holden retired from active service and opened a ship repair facility near the Human Transit Hub, and by all accounts it is very busy because his reputation is exactly what you would expect. Nadia Birch stayed in communications work and was part of the team that upgraded the compact relay network to the current standard, a project that took 3 years and significantly improved response times for distress signals across all member systems. She is not someone most people would name when they think about the events I have described. She was young, she had a specific technical role, she was not on the command deck during the battle. But the broadcast she assembled and transmitted was, in the assessment of everyone who later studied the political aftermath, The singles action that made the compact response inevitable. She turned a battle into a record that the galaxy could not claim not to have seen. I think about her sometimes when I sit at my archiving desk, about the particular power of the record, about Calvis telling me, years before all of this, that making sure the record survived was its own kind of service, even when no one was ready to read it yet. Someone was ready. They came 11 months later in a ship built to take punishment. And they brought their own archivist habits with them, even while the hull was still glowing from re-entry. I keep the recording I made in the sub-level vault on the night before the Unyielding arrived. I have listened to it many times, my own voice, dry with dust and exhaustion, cataloging the silences. Every diplomatic body that had been asked and had said nothing useful. I hear myself saying those last 4 words in the measured tone of a man closing a case. No aid was expected. It is the most incorrect statement I have ever committed to record. I know, as an archivist, that incorrect records still belong in the archive. They tell you something about the state of knowledge at the time they were made. They show you the shape of what was believed before the thing that changed it. My recording from that night tells you exactly what the galaxy looked like from our position at our lowest point. Silent, indifferent, too large and too settled to be moved. And then something moved. I have written on the spine of this record the words I decided on that night in the broken archive, looking at fire falling from a sky that had decided not to be silent after all. I write them again here, at the close of this account, because the archive is not complete until the correction is entered. No aid was expected. A human warship came anyway. Remember this distinction.